Hello everyone, welcome to January. Happy New Year. Probably wondering why we're staring at my modded Game Boys. Well, December was basically DOS-cember, retro computing, specifically MS-DOS and things like that. And I figured I'd take a break from retro computing for a while because we're all probably sick of it for a little bit. And I wanted to do a proper game room tour anyway, but I didn't want to do one of those 2-3 hour long videos where they go over every single item that they own, or even just at a glance and things like that. So I figured I'd break it up into multiple different parts, starting with my handheld collection, and then I'd move on to some other segment. Now, I don't think I'm going to be doing this like weekly until I'm done. I don't even know if I'm going to do like one of these videos a month. It might be one every few months, maybe one every 6 months, maybe one a year. I'm not sure yet. But I do know that I wanted to start with my handheld collection, specifically my modded consoles, and we'll move on to the rest. And we'll start off with the Game Boy Advance, because it was the first handheld mod that I did. And the case I got off of Amazon, it's one of those soft touch cases, had to be physically modded inside to fit the IPS screen. Wasn't perfect. I don't know if you can see some sharp cuts and things like that. The screen lens isn't perfectly aligned, or more accurately, the display itself isn't completely aligned. I ended up using the original buttons, I think. I don't think this came with buttons. I don't remember. It was a while ago. But I like it. It works. I did not solder the L and R buttons to adjust brightness, settings, things like that. So limited in functionality, but it works, and I was proud of it. So the next mod that I did was the original Game Boy. Picked up one that had a busted shell. They said it was a broken screen. Screen was actually fine, and we'll get to that in a bit. It was just a screen lens that was damaged. I think there was some mild corrosion on some of the battery terminals, so I had to replace those. But that wasn't that big of a deal. The shell was a mostly no-cut one. I had to do a little bit of trimming to get the IPS screen in there. You may notice a little white border around. The original screen lens I bought for this was supposed to be compatible with the IPS mod, but it was actually a little larger, and so part of the screen was cut out. So I went back and purchased one that we swear it's the right one, and well, as you can see, there's still a little bit of white showing. What I may do in the future is just peel this off using either a heat gun on low heat or a hair dryer. Take a suction cup, peel this off, and just color that in with like maybe a blue marker or something like that. I'm not sure. We'll see. I went with a all-white shell. At the time, I don't know if they had discontinued. They were just out of stock of the ones that had the Nintendo Game Boy logo silkscreen on there. So I went with this instead. Went with a blue accent color. I don't remember why I stuck with using white start and select buttons, but I did. And it did not come with that. They had to send it to me in a separate order. But overall, I did like this mod too. I do have a solution for that missing text there. I may do a YouTube short showing how I will fix that if I haven't already done it. So next, we'll move on to the Game Boy Pocket. And for those that don't know, the Game Boy Pocket is just a smaller version of the original Game Boy. Instead of a pea green screen, it was black and white. And there were two kind of variations of it. Their initial batch did not have a power LED. They added one after the fact. For this one, I went with a soft touch black with a white button accent and screen lens. I think it looks really slick. This one did have some significant damage on there. I think I had to solder on a new battery terminal. The other thing is that the screws that it came with, they did not screw in properly. They would not go all the way and hold the two halves of the shell together, so I had to use the original ones, tri-wing. I did use the Phillips inside, though. Those were fine. So Game Boy Pocket, again, it's really neat, nice and portable, even more so than the original Game Boy. There was a Japanese variant known as the Game Boy Lite, which had one of those indigo backlights in there. Never left Japan, I'm not sure why. And then probably my favorite mod to date was the Game Boy Color. I had gotten inspiration from other modders that had gone with an all-white setup, so I did the exact same thing. This was the IPSQ5, I believe, which has the screen lens laminated to the screen, so there's virtually no gap, which makes for a really clear picture. all white buttons, of course, and everything. I will probably do a few more mods. I mean, I do have that Game Boy Pocket that I picked up that seems to have some sort of weird corrosion damage on the shell itself, but it does work otherwise. Has a bad screen. I'll have to get that replaced. So I'll do a mod on that one, and I will probably, over time, pick up a few more consoles and mod them just because I like some of the newer options that came out. Plus, I kind of want to build a new Game Boy Advance that I do a better job on than I did with that one. But again, it was my first Game Boy mod, so I cut myself some slack. But these are my current collection of modded Game Boys, and like I said, I'll work on some more. But that's enough of that. Let's move on to the rest of the collection. Once again, we'll start with the Game Boy Advance. That is my original launch edition Game Boy Advance. It is in pretty much perfect condition, no yellowing, no real grime or anything built up anywhere, despite the fact that I play this quite often. No corrosion in the battery compartment. The foam that's behind there is probably deteriorated. I'm not going to find out though. But I got this launch day. I was working at Best Buy at the time. I was working that day, in fact, and I picked it up at the end of my shift. And at the time, I forget if my car was in a shop or if my mom's was, but she ended up picking me up from work. So while I was waiting, I was outside on the bench playing Super Mario Advance, which was basically a port of Super Mario Bros. 2 from Super Mario All-Stars. So I'm not going to touch this at all. I'm not going to mod it or anything. And I'm going to try to keep it in as pristine condition as I possibly can. Even the screen lens is virtually scratch-free. So next we'll look at the Game Boy Color. This I picked up when I decided I was going to get back into retro collecting. And in fact, I showcased this. This was technically the third video on my channel, but it was episode 2, where I did a little retrospective. It was in pretty good shape. Came with 3 games. And I think I paid about $45 for this, which is kind of insane because a full repair one now goes for about that price. You're not going to get a Game Boy Color in good shape, probably for anything less than $60, let alone with 3 games. The Game Boy Color was a interesting release. If I remember correctly, Nintendo was working on the successor to the Game Boy, which I think was Project Atlantis, and it ultimately evolved into the Game Boy Advance. So they released this kind of as a stopgap. More powerful CPU, full color display, etc. I was intrigued by it when I was a kid, well, teenager, but I said, nah, I don't need one of those. I've got my Game Boy, I've got the Super Game Boy, so I was kind of all set on that. But as an adult with funds available to me, I figured I'd pick one of these up so I can have it in my collection. Next, we'll move on to the Game Boy Pocket. And this is pretty much an original Game Boy Pocket with the exception of the screen lens. This was an aftermarket one. I haven't even peeled the protective film off of it yet. But this came about from the Game Boy Pocket mod that I showed earlier, because when I picked that one up, I was trying to find one that was kind of in bad shape. And when I got it, it was in much better shape than I thought. And I said, well, I don't want to waste these parts. I don't want them to go to waste or anything like that. I don't want to just toss them. So I instead went and picked up another one and married the parts together. This one was very challenging. The battery terminals were completely corroded, and there was extensive corrosion on the interior. The start button did not work at all. I had to solder a very, very fine wire between 2 pads to get it to work. Very challenging, but I'm happy that I was able to save an original Game Boy Pocket. So, and kind of a similar story with the original Game Boy, as I mentioned before. The one that I initially purchased to mod had a good screen. It was just a screen lens that was bad, had a bad shell. Everything else was good, so I picked another one up that had a bad screen for sure. And the screen lens in this, I don't know if you can see, definitely has some wear and tear on it, but it's the original one, and I figured that's fine. But I got this one working. I had to replace the bottom 2 battery terminals, but otherwise it works great, so it doesn't even have any missing lines on it or anything. Let's move down to the next shelf. So on this shelf, I've got my Analog Pocket, my Game Boy Game Genie, as well as my Game Boy Advance game collection. Start off with the Analog Pocket. I'll try to keep it brief because I plan on actually doing another follow-up video to this. For those who don't know, this is an FPGA-based Game Boy. Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance console. It's emulation, but it's through hardware instead of software, if that makes any sense. This is a fantastic console, wonderfully built, I think fairly priced, but the execution of shipping and purchasing and everything is kind of what ruins the value of this thing. I don't know why Analog does what it does, but it's very frustrating. The release of the pocket adapters that let you play Game Gear, Atari Lynx, TurboGrafx Express, which is just a portable TurboGrafx 16. And I think the Neo Geo Pocket is just a complete disaster. I wanted to pick up the Game Gear adapter. It's $30, which is fair, but shipping was $30, and that's not fair in my opinion. And then when they released the additional adapters, they released them as a bundle instead, and you had to buy all three of them. And I did not want the Pocket. If I could have substituted the Game Gear one, okay, fine, deal, let's do it. But that'll be a future rant. We won't go too much further into that. Next is the Game Genie. This is a complete in-box Game Genie. I showed it in a recent pickups video. I picked it up at a game show. It has a little code booklet in there, as well as stickers with various codes that you attach to the back of the games, as well as the Game Genie itself. I had one growing up. Got rid of it, of course, when I sold a lot of my consoles as a kid, like a lot of us foolishly did. And, well, trying to make up for that. But let's take a look at the games that I've got for Game Boy Advance. I've got the original manual for Super Mario Advance, not the original box though. I definitely got rid of that a long time ago. Same thing with Mario Kart Super Circuit, and I have the original Game Boy Advance instruction booklet, but not the box. I had the box somewhere, I don't know what I did with it. The only complete boxed game I have is Metroid Fusion. Got the box, the manual in there, and then I've got the game itself. I used to have the box for Zero Mission. I don't know what happened to it. Those of you that might not be familiar, those two games alone are worth, I think, at least $120 each. And if you have it complete, it's worth, I think, up to $300 each. Not that I plan on selling them or anything like that, at least not anytime soon, but it's good to know in the event that I do have to sell my collection for whatever reason, that, there is some value there. But as I mentioned, the first game that I ever got with it was a launch game, and it was Super Mario Advance, which is just a remake port of Super Mario Bros. 2 from the Super Nintendo version of Super Mario All-Stars. They added some extra features and things like that, extra power-ups. Unfortunately, they added voice acting to it too, which made it really annoying, but Nintendo was trying to do a little bit more of that as time went on. Mario Kart Super Circuit is basically Game Boy Advance's Mario Kart. It has all new levels, but once you complete the game, I forget if you have to complete the game at 150cc or if you just beat the game, but it will then unlock the Super Nintendo Mario Kart levels as well. Oh, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about each game itself. If you guys want to see like an actual review or anything like that of any specific game or games, let me know in the comments below and I'll try to work on a video for you guys. Next we'll go with Legend of Zelda Link to the Past, as well as Four Swords. This is a port of Zelda 3, Legend of Zelda Link to the Past from the Super Nintendo, with some voice acting, although it's not as annoying as Mario. But it also includes Four Swords Adventure, or not Adventure, just Four Swords, which allows you to link up to 3 other Game Boys, well, Game Boy Advances, and play Four Swords. I never got to play that. I can't tell you anything about it other than what I've seen on YouTube. Next is Super Mario Advance 4 Super Mario Bros. 3. See, this is where I think Nintendo screwed up on the naming and numbering of the Super Mario Advance games. This is a port of Super Mario Bros. 3 from Super Mario All-Stars, which is why it's confusing that it's Super Mario Advance 4. I believe Super Mario Advance 2 was Super Mario World, and Super Mario Advance 3 was Yoshi's Island, for whatever reason. I'm not sure why they never ported Super Mario Bros. 1 or Super Mario Bros. Lost Levels, which was Super Mario Bros. 2 in Japan. Probably because they had technically ported that to the Game Boy Color, and they figured that's a little too much. Not sure, but this is Super Mario Bros. 3. This supported I forget what they call it, the E-Card reader, where you can scan in cards and unlock additional levels and additional power-ups and things like that. I never got to try it on original hardware, but I did get to try it on the Wii U release of Super Mario Bros. 3, Super Mario Advance 4, which included the E-World and the E-Reader levels. So the audio is missing from this particular clip. I'm not sure why. So I'm kind of doing a pseudo voiceover. Next, we'll move on to Metroid Zero Mission. It's a remake of the original Metroid from the NES. Updated graphics make it more in line with Super Metroid, Metroid Fusion, etc. And it's more than likely using the same engine as Metroid Fusion. It basically is a retelling of the original story. You know, Samus lands on Zebes, has to sit there and destroy the Mother Brain, etc., etc. But they added some additional content in the game, as well as a prologue. I'm not going to spoil it for you in case you haven't played it, but it does set up a lot of the lore. And of course, now we're going to move on to Metroid Fusion, which is Metroid 4. I believe it originally started off as a Game Boy Color game, and they ended up porting it to Game Boy Advance since it was close enough in the release. The engine that it's using was actually, I believe, based on WarioLand 3, because there is a debug room that people discovered that has similar graphics and tile sets from that game. Kind of thought that was kind of funny where they took a action platformer and turned it into a Metroidvania style game. Both Fusion and Zero Mission are worth quite a bit of money. Loose copies are $50-$60. Boxed and complete are roughly $150 to $200. So next we will move on to Namco Museum, which includes copies, or ports I should say, of classic arcade games Miss Pac-Man, Pole Position, Dig Dug, Galaga, and Galaxian. Next we're going to move on to Final Fantasy IV Advance, which is a port of the Super NES Super Famicom game Final Fantasy II, or more accurately Final Fantasy IV. It retains the overall graphic style, slightly enhanced font for the smaller screen. Unfortunately, where they kind of screwed up was the soundtrack. Instead of using the original samples from the Super NES Super Famicom version, they included updated ones. Now, the Game Boy Advance, even though it had better sound overall over the Super Nintendo, for whatever reason, the quality of it just wasn't as good, so they probably had to change the instruments to compensate for that. There are ROM patches to kind of reintroduce the original soundtrack, so there is ways to fix it if you have a flash cart. Final Fantasy II was one of my favorite Final Fantasy games. It goes Final Fantasy VI or 3, Final Fantasy 4 or 2, and then Final Fantasy 5. I picked this up for obvious reasons. They did include bonus content, and it changed the story ever so slightly from the original ones. The translation itself has been corrected over the original Super Nintendo version, so. And last, we're going to take a look at the 369-in-1 cart. I've already done a review on it on my channel a while back, so I'm not going to go over it too much. It's a multi-cart. Its legality is iffy. And now we will move down to the next shelf, which has my Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. So now we move down to my Game Boy and Game Boy Color shelf. First of all, we've got the GB Boy Color there. Won't go too much into it. I've already shown that off quite a bit on this channel. For those of you not aware, it is a Game Boy Color clone. It is not FPGA. It is not emulation. It is cloned chips of the original Game Boy Color hardware, put into a shell that kind of resembles the Game Boy Color, even similar name, GB Boy Color. However, it has a backlit screen, which when it came out was kind of impressive, since even Nintendo didn't have that option at the time. And I believe that it came out before all the different IPS mods came out, the different backlight mods. And it was also very affordable. When I picked it up, I think I paid like $30-$35 for it. Has since gone up in price, probably because of part shortages and things like that. For those who want to be able to play Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, but don't want to have to fight trying to find a working Game Boy Color and doing an IPS mod and all of that, it's a good option. So here is my current Game Boy Color collection. As you can see, I have the manual to Legend of Zelda Oracle of Ages. I used to have the box, not sure what I did with it. Again, probably threw it out like an idiot, but it is what it is. Let's go start with Dragon Warrior 1 and 2. Showed us off in a pickups video a while back. It is a port/demake of a Super Famicom title, Dragon Quest 1 and 2, which was a port remake of the original Dragon Quest, Dragon Warrior 1 and 2 from the NES/Famicom. You know, better color, enhanced soundtrack. So with this one, they kind of had to demake it a little bit because obviously the Game Boy Color was not as powerful as the Super Nintendo. Plus, if you notice, it's a black cartridge, which means it'll work in the original Game Boy as well. But it's a good game. If you manage to find it, pick it up. I do recommend it, especially if you like the Dragon Warrior, Dragon Quest series. Next is Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening DX. This is a remake of the original Link's Awakening for the Game Boy Color. And again, you notice it's in a black cartridge, means it will work on the original Game Boy as well as just good old-fashioned Link's Awakening. They did add additional content, a dungeon that is highly reliant on color. I don't even think you can get through it without having it on the Game Boy Color or a newer Game Boy console. You might be able to fudge your way through it, but I really doubt it. Like I said, it's very dependent on colors. But otherwise, it's Link's Awakening, but in full color mode. So next, we'll move on to Legend of Zelda Oracle of Seasons. This is a Game Boy Color game only. This will only work on the Game Boy Color, and this was a collaboration between Capcom. It was originally meant to be a trilogy. There was going to be like the Triforce trilogy or something like that. I'm not sure what the third game was going to be called. Gotta change this case, it's got a crack in it. But Nintendo ended up only releasing 2 of the games, Oracle of Seasons and of course Oracle of Ages, which I'll get to in a bit. Haven't had much time to play this one just yet, but it's going to be a similar engine to that of Link's Awakening, so it's going to play in similar fashion. Like I said, I'm not going too in-depth with these games. If you want to see a proper review, let me know. Here we've got Oracle of Ages. Why is it like that? Oracle of Ages. This was actually given to me as either a birthday gift or a Christmas gift from one of my best friends many years ago when it came out. He worked at GameStop, so he picked one up this for me. And I played it way back in the day, but it's been a long time since I've touched it. I probably want to revisit it. Another fun game. Again, it was intended to be a part of a trilogy. Never made it out that way, so. Next couple of games I did a review on and kind of gave my thoughts on them, but we'll go over it real quick here. And that is Super Mario Land DX Color, which this is a pirate cart, as you can tell by the blue shell. Well, a lot of them are. And this is basically just an IPS patch applied to the original Super Mario Land that turned into a Game Boy Color game. And I went over it. I was impressed with the quality of the cartridge and the fact that it played well and everything. Wasn't impressed with the fact that not only are they parting cartridges, parting games, but they're also parting the IPS mods themselves and not giving any credit to the original developer. Since I picked this up, they have updated the patch a few times, made some changes because there are some inconsistencies and some things that a lot of people weren't in agreement with. For example, Mario's sprite was changed from the original one to something a little bit, I don't want to quite call it chibi style, but close enough. Again, it works. You can put it in your Game Boy Color and it'll play just fine, but I wasn't happy with the fact that they weren't giving credit where credit was due. Same thing with Super Mario Land 2. Again, it's a patched ROM, Game Boy Color. There's even on the sticker here, it includes new playable character Luigi. Again, this was part of the ROM patch. It was never in the original game. It was definitely not done by the person that created these carts, but it is what it is. I bought them from a novelty standpoint. I haven't really played them much since because I don't want to necessarily support stuff like that. Instead, what I'll probably do is just get a flash cart and put the originals on there with the patch appropriately. So next we'll take a look at this 108-in-1 cartridge, which I did a review on early on in my channel. Again, another novelty thing, same blue cartridge, same PCB. It's one of those multi-carts that have a bunch of games. They pretty much advertise Pokemon and stuff like that. Has save functionality, but Again, it's not something that I necessarily recommend picking up unless you just want a novelty. The legality of this is definitely questionable. And yeah, that's all we'll say about that. Next is A Bug's Life. This game here actually came with 2 other games when I picked up my Game Boy Color. And as you can see by the black cartridge, it should work in the original Game Boy as well. It's based off the movie A Bug's Life. A lot of times these movie tie-in games are not very good. Played it for like a hot minute and like, whatever. I sold the other 2 games that I got with that. Tried to sell this one, it wasn't worth anything. So they said, yeah, we can't take this. I'm like, okay, thanks. I'll just put it back on my shelf. Sorry to anyone that's a fan of the game. Next, we'll take a look at, actually, before we go there, we'll take a look at Donkey Kong Land. Now, I picked this up on eBay. It's got a torn label, but I paid less than it's worth. So, you know, that's fine. Again, this is for my collection. I'm not trying to like... I had it originally when I was a kid. It was a great game. It was initially supposed to be a port of Donkey Kong Country to the Game Boy and Super Game Boy. But instead they decided to go a different route and make a whole new game out of it, including adding additional content, different levels and things like that. And it came out pretty well. Playing on a Super Game Boy kind of shows off a little bit of the trouble and difficulty they had importing the fancy SGI graphics to Game Boy, but it still kind of works. It's still a fun game. They came out with 2 sequels, Donkey Kong Land 2 and 3. I don't have 3 yet. I don't know if I'm going to pick it up. We'll see. If I find a good deal on it, I might. But I want to talk about those before I went to Donkey Kong Country, because they did eventually port Donkey Kong Country to Game Boy, more specifically Game Boy Color, and this is a transparent shell, which means it will only work on the Game Boy Color or newer consoles. This is a full port of Donkey Kong Country using an enhanced engine, Donkey Kong Land engine. Some changes were made, but they're very minor. They don't impact the story at all. So if you play Donkey Kong Country on the Super Nintendo or Super Famicom, it's the same game, just on the go. Next, we'll take a look at Alleyway. I never owned the original, but I did play it because my cousin owned it. This is basically an Arkanoid clone featuring quote-unquote Mario. If we want to take a closer look here at the label. Mario with a blue hat and red overalls. Mario's wardrobe was very inconsistent in the early days. But it's basically just, you know, Arkanoid, Breakout, what have you. Fun, though. It's one of those games you can pick up, play a couple of rounds if you've got some time to kill. Good game in my opinion, but a lot of people had mixed feelings on it, and that's Mega Man for the Game Boy. It's Wily's Revenge, and it's basically, we'll call it an original Mega Man game for the Game Boy, but it basically uses the enemies from Mega Man 1 and Mega Man 2 to create a new game, new level designs of course, and slight remixes of the original themes. The sticker in the back is actually a Game Genie code when I originally had the Game Genie for the Game Boy. Just some quick access stickers. There was also a Mega Man 2, 3, 4, and 5. Mega Man 2 was unique in that it was buggy and it did not include the original themes from Mega Man 2 on the NES, and on top of that there was a bug in the music where one of the notes was kind of off key or off octave or something like that. There was a patch to fix that, but you know, it's probably the worst version out of all of them, despite the fact that this one had a lot of control issues, much like the original Mega Man for the NES. Mega Man 3 I owned as well. I don't anymore, unfortunately, because again, stupid kids sold it, or I should say traded it away to FuncoLand or GameStop or something like that. But that was a really good one in my opinion. I did not own Mega Man 4 for the Game Boy. I did own Mega Man 5. Mega Man 5, by the way, very pricey game nowadays because it came out late in the Game Boy's lifespan, and not that many copies were sold apparently, but it's unique in that it was a brand new game for the Game Boy. All new Robot Masters. It was a Super Game Boy title which had enhanced colors and background and things like that. Next we'll take a look at Metroid 2, Return of Samus. This here was, well, the second in the Metroid line of games, and kind of a large game overall in terms of the map. A lot of areas to explore. Definitely expanded on a lot of the different techniques and skills and move sets and everything from the original Metroid. Additional power-ups. Expanded the lore of the Metroids and Samus as well as the Chozo race, or Kozo. I'm calling them Chozo because that's what I've always called them. At me, I don't care. There was a remake on the 3DS, Metroid Samus Returns. Same game basically, just with enhanced graphics, additional story plots, things like that. But this was the original one, and there is a patch out there that'll turn it into a Game Boy Color game. So those of you that have ROM cards, if you have the original one, rip it, patch it, and you can play in color. There were some enhanced palettes if you put it on the Game Boy Color or Game Boy Advance. There was nothing for Super Game Boy because this came out way before that. So it is what it is. But it's a really good game. A little more frustrating than the original Metroid was even. A lot more exploration and backtracking and things like that. But it makes for a lot of playability. We won't cover Super Mario Land 1 or 2 just because of the fact that I kind of just covered them with the fake DX versions. But if you're not familiar with what they are, Mario games for the Game Boy. It was developed by I forget the team. It wasn't the original Mario team. I think it was kind of like a side project that they worked on in spare time, showed it, and said, yeah, okay, we'll make it. They do not take place in the Mushroom Kingdom. They do not feature Princess Toadstool or Toads or anything like that. Mario Land is where Daisy was initially introduced. Super Mario Land 2 is where Wario was initially introduced. So, if you're not familiar with those games, pick them up. They're not super expensive because there's a ton of them out there. And give them a play. They will not play like the original Mario games, kind of in terms of the way they handle and control. You'll have to get used to that. But once you do, they're great games. This here is an LGN classic, WWF King of the Ring. It's just, WWF game for the Game Boy, and didn't have it growing up. But I decided I wanted to collect all of the old school WWF games for all of the old school consoles, NES, Super NES, Game Boy, Game Gear, Genesis, so on. Played it briefly, and it plays like any of the other WWF games did at the time. Just one of those little button mashers, quick play, things like that. Next, we'll move on to Tecmo Bowl. This game is very famous on the NES, and more specifically Super Tecmo Bowl on the SNES and the Genesis. So this is just a Game Boy version of the game. If you played it, you know it's a good game. Even if you're not like a huge fan of American style football, it's still a fun game to play. So there's that. And of course, the king of all Game Boy games, Tetris. If you bought a Game Boy back when it came out, you got this with it. Smartest thing Nintendo ever could have done was packing Tetris in with the Game Boy, because Tetris was kind of a hot thing at the time. And this is a perfect game to play on the go, whether you want to play for 5 minutes or 5 hours or anything like that. It's fun. It's Tetris. There's not much else I can really say about it. If you haven't played Tetris, what are you doing? Random battery there. Getting down the last few games here. This is Killer Instinct for the Game Boy and Super Game Boy. It is exactly what it sounds like, a port of the Super Nintendo version. Akin to Donkey Kong Land being a port of Donkey Kong Country. Well, not a port, but you know what I mean. This here, it's Killer Instinct. If you played it on the Super NES or in the arcade, or Killer Instinct Gold or anything like that, that's what this is. It's just in handheld format. I picked it up just because I thought it'd be a neat little novelty back in the day, and since I owned it as a kid, I wanted to get it again as an adult. Again, it's one of those things you can pick up, play for a few minutes on the go, and have at it. So there's also that I don't have now that I did own growing up. I haven't found a copy yet, at least not for a reasonable price. There was a port of Street Fighter 2 for the Game Boy and Super Game Boy. One of these days I'm going to try to find it and add it to my collection. I've got one spot there, and I've got a few spots up there, so I can still add a few more games. This here is just WWF Superstars 2. It is, again, a similar WWF type game to that you had on the NES and Super Nintendo and all that. Includes Steel Cage mode and tag team action. Another one of those time killers. This here is probably one of the last releases actually because this is starting to transition into WWF's new logo, WWE, or just WW, because they got sued by the World Wildlife Foundation and lost somehow. So Acclaim Sports, so it's not an LJN title, but it's basically the same thing. Similar engine, similar gameplay, things like that. This is a Game Boy Color only game. And then last but not least is WWF Raw, which released on pretty much every console at the time. Super Nintendo, Genesis, 32X. There might have been a Sega CD version, I don't remember. And then of course there was a Game Gear version and a Game Boy version. And again, just button masher. So that's it for Game Boy. We'll move down to the bottom shelf. I can't lower my tripod any further, so I'll have to pan the camera down, so it might be odd angles, but you guys will survive, I'm sure. So here's my Game Gear collection. Remember the Game Gear here. It's one that I repaired, replaced the capacitors on. Did a slight mod to it, replaced the buttons with some red ones and a red glass screen lens, calling it the, you know, Game Gear Master System Edition or Master System Portable, because it basically is. Of course, when I modded it, I didn't realize that there was a small crack over here, and well, that's on me. Maybe one day I'll Bondo it or something, or get a new shell. But otherwise, it is in working condition, and I'm happy with it. In the back over here is the Game Genie 4. I never owned one of those, so I was really lucky to find one almost complete. It's missing the booklet. I did find some booklets on eBay. So I'm gonna pick it up and hopefully, you know, get that in and complete this Game Genie. And then of course, my very small, meager, but slowly growing Game Gear game collection. Columns, kind of Sega's answer to Tetris. It's kind of like Puyo Puyo and games like that, where you've got to match up colors and shapes and things like that. And of course, we've got Sonic the Hedgehog for the Game Gear, which I believe was similar to the Master System version. Sonic the Hedgehog 2, I don't know if that was the same as the Master System version or not, but this also came with another game, and that's Sonic and Tails. If I can get this to focus correctly here. So 2 games in one, pretty cool. The last Sonic game I own is Sonic Chaos. But I got this, and I like the fact that I actually have the case for it too. This is a whole new game. I don't think this was released in the Master System, but I might be wrong. It might have been released on the Master System in Brazil, because the Master System there is just like king. In fact, I think they're still manufacturing them, so way to go. And then of course, WWF games, WWF Raw, which I kind of talked about with the Game Boy. And there's also WrestleMania Steel Cage Challenge, which I believe I have on the NES as well. And again, similar engines, button mashers, things like that. Alright, so that's it for Game Boy and Game Gear. Let's move to the other shelf that way and finish up my handheld collection tour. And here we've got the Switch that I refurbished and repaired a while ago. Had to replace some components inside. One thing I've been noticing with it is that this thumbstick will randomly just have this goo on it. And I know what you're thinking. I'm not playing it with dirty hands or anything like that. I don't know if it's just the material or what have you, but I've had to clean it 3 times since I refurbed it. The right stick is fine. It's just the left one. I'm not sure. Maybe the rubber's deteriorating. Is it a known issue with the Switch Lites? Not sure. If you know, let me know in the comments below. Edition of Zelda Game & Watch. This was the 35th anniversary edition that comes with Zelda 1, Zelda 2, and Link's Awakening. Great little buy. 50 bucks may be a little pricey, especially since they did not include the DX version of Link's Awakening. They instead went with the original one. Missed opportunity there. I think this has been hacked and the ROM replaced. There's probably some subreddit or something like that about it. I may do that just to right Nintendo's wrong. And then this here is just a Game Boy game-shaped case that came with one of the screen mounts that I picked up. I thought it's a neat little novelty item. Neat little case too. A little foam pad inside. I'm assuming it's anti-static. It's always good to have anti-static foam pads. But it's just there. Just as, you know, but it's there as a knick-knack, and I hate these stands. they just don't stand correctly. So there's that. I'm not going to show off like my Switch game collection necessarily. I'll include that in a future video when I show off my regular Nintendo Switch. But we'll move down instead to some games and additional handhelds. So here is my DS and new 2DS XL/3DS, since I don't have one of those, collection here. That is I picked it up used. It says EB Games. It might have already become a GameStop at the time, I don't remember. But you see it's a silver box one. Unfortunately, what came inside was the blue one, which is fine, the blue one's nice, but I don't have the box for the blue one, and I kind of want that now. But it is the original box and console that I picked up used at the time. If anyone has the opposite problem, wants to do a quick trade, let me know. The box, not the console, of course. The reason I bought the DS is because I really wanted to play New Super Mario Bros., which was the first proper 2D Mario game that came out since Super Mario World. I'm not counting Super Mario World 2 or anything like that, because even though those are in the Mario universe, they're not Mario games, they're centered around Yoshi. So this right here was the first proper one. I was very happy when this came out, and I had no intention of actually buying a DS, but I said, you know what, I'm gonna buy it just for this game, and because of that I was able to expand my collection. But it's New Super Mario Brothers. We'll get into that in a little bit. The new Nintendo 2DS XL I picked up because I wanted to play A Link Between Worlds, and as a side benefit I got to play the other Zelda games on there as well too, but we'll get to that in a bit. Actually no, we can get to that right now, because, well, before we even do that, there's the consoles on display. Like I said, got the blue DS and I got the teal, blue, I'm not sure what color that is, whatever Nintendo considers it. So, but here is Link Between Worlds. It's the Nintendo Selects version. I did buy it brand new, so I know some people in the collection world are like, oh no, it's not. I don't care. The game is the exact same. So I do have that. A very good game, very fun game. I still prefer A Link to the Past, but this is a close second in terms of 2D Zelda games go. If you haven't played it, pick it up. And then of course we've got another Nintendo Select Player's Choice type game for Ocarina of Time 3D. Again, this was picked up brand new. I think I paid $20 for this. If you ever played Ocarina of Time on the N64, it's effectively the same game. There's some slight changes in there, enhancements. In my opinion, better graphics, but everything else is roughly the same. Same thing goes for Majora's Mask 3D, except this is, I bought this one used. I forget how much I paid for it, but it's not the Nintendo Select version. So these do support 3D mode on the 3DS if you've got it. I don't have that obviously on the 2DS, but even if I did, I wouldn't use that feature because it would hurt my eyes. Next is Super Mario Kart 7. That was weird. Anyway, Super Mario Kart 7, bought it used. Obviously, you can tell by the creases and all that. Was it complete though? Yeah, it was complete, so that's why I picked it up. I don't pick, if I can help it, I don't pick up incomplete games, but if price is a factor, then yeah. Again, it's Mario Kart on the 3DS. If you've played Mario Kart before, you've played Mario Kart 7, so. Now we've got Metroid Samus Returns, not the original label, because I could not find a copy with original label or original case or anything like that. But again, since this is for my own collection, I don't care. I'll print out a really shoddy design and that's it. Again, this is basically a remake of Metroid 2, A Return of Samus, with some additional story plots and things like that, that, without spoiling too much, will kind of also set up Metroid Fusion. So, another good game. Introduces some of the mechanics that are now out in Metroid Dread. And Super Mario 3D Land. There's a counterpart, Super Mario 3D World for the Wii U. It's basically just kind of, I consider it kind of more of a 2.5, 2.75D game versus a 3D game. I think a 3D Mario game is more like Mario 64, Mario Sunshine, Mario Odyssey, things like that. Fun game, definitely, especially the console version of it. If you like Mario games, pick it up. Now we're moving on to the DS games here. Final Fantasy IV, as I said before, it's one of my favorite Final Fantasy games. Well, it's actually one of my favorite fantasy games of all time. Final Fantasy 6 or 3 as it came out here in the West is probably my favorite, followed by 4 and then 5, which this is also known as Final Fantasy 2. This is a complete 3D remake of Final Fantasy 4, utilizing both screens. It has some cinematics in there. If you've played Final Fantasy 2 before, Final Fantasy 4, I'm just going to call it Final Fantasy 4 from now on. If you've played Final Fantasy 4 before, you'll be able to get into this game right away. It takes a little adjustment with the 3D, but you get used to it real quick. Unfortunately, same complaint as the Game Boy Advance version is the soundtrack on there is effectively the Game Boy Advance soundtrack, only a lot cleaner sounding since the DS could do audio a lot better. But it is still worth the pickup. I don't know what its value is or anything like that. I don't know if it's an expensive game or not. So if it's expensive, sorry, I'm trying not to get you guys to buy expensive games necessarily, but it is a good game. Mario Kart DS, another printed label because I bought it at a garage sale and the label was just destroyed. Paid $2 for it, so I can't really complain. The game had a bunch of gunk on it. I was able to clean it up and it works just fine. So I picked this up for $2. I think it goes for like 20. So again, Mario Kart DS, it's Super Mario Kart. But I had to have it because I had to have it. Here's Ridge Racer DS, which is a port of Ridge Racer 64. Basically, again, had to reprint the label because, yeah. But if you've ever played Ridge Racer before, it's a fun game. The DS version is definitely a little bit more limited in terms of its controls and things like that. I'm not a huge fan of the touchscreen controls, so I try to stick to regular controls. But it's another one of those time wasters. I picked it up only because it was cheap. Now we'll go back to New Super Mario Bros. Again, first proper 2D Mario game since Super Mario World. And I was really happy when this came out. And I was also happy when they came out with a Wii version of it as well. And that they still continued on with New Super Mario Bros. Wii U, or New Super Mario Bros. U. And then there's Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe on the Switch. There's also a New Super Mario Bros. 2 for the DS, which I don't have. I think I own it. I don't have a case for it, though, I believe. Yeah. There it is right there. So I don't have a case for it. Anything, so I just store it in this little box here. But yeah, so I've got that. Again, if you like Mario games, I recommend picking it up. And then of course there's this DS multi-cart, which there actually aren't a whole lot of DS games on here. There's some Game Boy games and I think some NES games even, which don't play well because the emulator for the DS is not very good. Probably plays a little better on the 2DS XL or 3DS. Again, I picked this up as a novelty, did a review on it. Again, it's one of those legally ambiguous things. Buyer beware. And then again, like I said before, here are the actual consoles themselves. I do play them from time to time still, and I know why have this still if you've got this. Again, this is how I first started playing DS games, so we'll move down to the next shelf and wrap this video up soon. So this is probably the best view I'm able to get of this shelf. For some reason, I'm just too close to the couch to do anything. But this is my PSP shelf and collection. As I've mentioned before many times, I picked up the PSP brand new from Target like a few years after it was discontinued. There was like one left randomly in a case. I wasn't even looking for it. I was just looking for random deals, and I saw that. It's like, nope, picking that up. I think I paid $80 or $100 or something like that for it. Didn't have any games or anything like that for it. Didn't even have a memory card or anything like that. So that kind of started me on that little path there. Here's the box here. Again, original box and everything. I don't have the original battery for it anymore, unfortunately, because of the fact that it had died. So the other thing with the PSP that I'm kind of not happy about is that the paint is peeling off on both sides, not evenly either, and replacement shells are not available. I mean, they are, but they're apparently all garbage. I've been hoping that one of these modding companies, like Retro Modding and stuff like that, would have some, but they don't. So it's kind of like find one on AliExpress, eBay, Amazon, and just cross your fingers. Everyone's recommendation is just find a busted one on there and swap parts out, but what's the guarantee that this isn't going to happen to them either? So I've been thinking about trying to find a new shell for it, but we'll see. Yeah. I don't know if anyone else has that problem too, or if it's just me. I got unlucky. There's a PSP 3000 though, so the first game I ever picked up for it was Final Fantasy IV. Although you may notice it is still wrapped. I bought this brand new on Amazon. I think I paid $15 for it, and I think it's probably gone up in value to about $40. So I ended up picking up another copy of it used so I could play it. This here is the ultimate version of Final Fantasy IV. The graphics on this one are they've been improved over Game Boy Advance, so they're not similar in style to like the Super Nintendo graphics were or the Game Boy Advance one, but they look good. Definitely better than the BS that Square released on iOS and Android and eventually Steam a long time ago, before they did the pixel remasters, of course. The font is good on there and everything, and the unique thing about this is that it also includes Final Fantasy IV: The After Years, which was a direct sequel released initially only in Japan on cell phones, and they were released episodically, and eventually it was released as WiiWare, again episodically, but using Super Nintendo style graphics. And a lot of people kind of dogged on the game. I liked it. I think it was an interesting story. You know, it's tough to make a classic RPG game nowadays because of how advanced things are. Storytelling has gotten more advanced and everything. So I don't know if people were nitpicking because, well, this story isn't as good as like Final Fantasy VII or Final Fantasy 13 or anything like that. It's supposed to be more simplistic. It's supposed to be similar to that of Final Fantasy IV. And there are going to be people out there that still aren't going to agree. I don't care. But the neat thing is that there was this interlude that came out that tied the two games directly together. So you're effectively getting 3 games in one. Well, 2.5 games in one. But it does tell you directly what happened after Final Fantasy IV and the events that lead up to the after years. One of the reasons why I'm saying this is the ultimate version of Final Fantasy IV is that you can choose to play the original Super Nintendo Super Famicom soundtrack. That right there is what makes it key. Now there are exceptions with the after years. There are some new scenarios, new areas that have their own themes. Those never existed on the Super Nintendo, and Square was not going to sit there and re-record them, so they will sound more modern. For the most part, you get the original Super Nintendo soundtrack if you want it. Again, if you are a fan of Final Fantasy IV, I recommend picking this up. Even at like $40, I think it's still worth it. Let's see if I can manage to put it back. Hey, look at that. Alright, let's take a look at the rest of these PSP games here. We'll take a look here at Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII, one of the sequels to Final Fantasy VII. This was recently released as a remake for, well, it's really more of a remaster than a remake for the Switch, PS4 and 5, and maybe the Xbox, I don't remember, I think Steam as well. It is not similar in gameplay to the original Final Fantasy VII. It's more of an action-based RPG. If you've played the Final Fantasy VII remaster, you'll get an idea of what it is. Here we have Grand Theft Auto Vice City Stories. It's the greatest hits version, but it is complete with everything. It's basically kind of like a sequel / alternate storyline for Grand Theft Auto Vice City. I think they ended up releasing them on either the PlayStation 2 or the PlayStation 3. Cool. So, also have Grand Theft Auto Liberty City Stories. This would be a follow-up to the original Grand Theft Auto. So, if you've played GTA 3 or any of those games. Next is Star Ocean First Departure. I do have the game on the Switch, but I figured I'd get the PSP version too. In fact, I got this before the Switch version because I forgot that they released it on there. But I figured I'd get this one, and I'll get the other one just to complete the storyline. It is complete. And when I say complete, I mean complete. Manual is in great shape. And it even has the warranty registration card in it still. So, and last but not least is Twisted Metal Head-On, which is just, I don't want to say it's a port, because it's not a port of the original PlayStation version. It is its own game. But it is Twisted Metal, so if you've ever played any of the Twisted Metal games, this is a fun little, again, it's one of those, time wasters. You've got a few minutes, an hour to kill or whatever. You've got that game there. I do remember playing Twisted Metal a lot on the original PlayStation. And down on the bottom shelf here, I just have some amiibos. I'm not an amiibo collector, but I figured I'd get a few just to pad the collection a little bit. All right, let's wrap this whole thing up. So yeah, that's my handheld collection. What do you guys think? Anything I need to add to it, besides some obvious missing titles and things like that? Like I said, Donkey Kong Land 3. I'm happy with my little collection here. I mean, even if all I had was my handheld collection, I'd be pretty thrilled as a retro collector. It's, these games, have a lot of fond memories. Been able to create a lot of new memories with it as well. And, modding these consoles was probably the most fun I've had, doing anything that was gaming related, but not playing games. So yeah, if there's anything missing in my collection, guys, that you think I really need to look at or check out, let me know. But yeah, that's it for this video, guys. Hopefully it was interesting for you guys, entertaining. I do plan on doing a little bit more with my collection here. I'll record some footage and stuff like that for the future, show off my Nintendo collection, Super Nintendo, Genesis, etc. I'm not sure how I want to format those just yet, because I kind of feel like if I just show off the Nintendo collection, it'll be a 5-10 minute video and that's it. Make it a little bit more substantive. So yeah, but if you stuck around to the end, thanks guys. I do appreciate you guys. I do appreciate all the new subscribers and the existing subscribers. Yeah, thanks for watching, guys. I'll catch you later.